The Economist.
Hello and welcome to The Intelligence from The Economist. I'm your host, Jason Palmer. Every weekday, we provide a fresh perspective on the events shaping your world. Russian forces simply need more men. Cannon fodder, let's be honest. But a full-on draft has proved incredibly unpopular. So the Kremlin is on a volunteer recruitment drive. We look at the adverts and the inducements that are drawing new troops in. And when people start to feel overwhelmed by the world that's brought to them by their smartphones, what do? They get dumb ones. We turn back technological time. But first,
I recently went to Barcelona to investigate the war on tourism.
Corbin Duncan writes about finance and economics for The Economist.
They are pretty grumpy. Locals in Barcelona have been protesting, wielding water pistols at tourists who they see as changing the character of their city. But it's not just Barcelona. All over Spain, the Canary Islands, Mallorca, but also in Greece and Portugal, in Tokyo and Seoul, locals and politicians are fighting back against what they see as mass tourism. While locals might have a point, tourism is not always a bad thing. In fact, it could be really good for a country's economy.
So before we pick that apart, give me a picture then of global tourism in terms of the numbers.
Tourism this year is experiencing a massive boom. A strength in the global economy and the American dollar is set to push international arrival numbers up to about 1.5 billion this year, and that's even greater than in 2019, pre the COVID pandemic. Familiar spots in Europe, like Greece, Spain, and in Portugal, are all booming, but really to find massive growth, you need to go to emerging markets. So places like Albania have seen the number of international arrivals double since 2019.
And presumably in familiar hotspots and growing ones, this is good news for those local economies, at least.
Tourism is big business. It accounts for about 3% of global GDP, 6% of all trade, and employs as many people as live in America. And so a big boom in this industry can deliver real goods to locals. And we're seeing that reflected in the growth rates of countries like Greece and Portugal and Spain. They all grew at 2% or more last year, whereas the EU average was about 0.4%. In those emerging markets, tourism's growth is also taking up a larger share of GDP. And so in Saudi Arabia, tourism contributes about a third more of GDP this year than it did last year. By the broadest definition, about a quarter of Albania's economic activity now relies on tourists, and that's up from about a fifth 5 years ago.
And yet at the same time, a really big story this year is how much anti-tourism sentiment there is here. What is the basis of that with all of that economic good flowing in?
Employment and tax receipts provided by tourism tend to offer diffuse benefits, but the costs of tourism tend to be really concentrated, and you can see it in the streets. Some of the locals I spoke to in Barcelona were particularly concerned about tacky tourist shops selling cannabis. These tend to be stores which focus and cater to tourists. But that is really indicative of a much bigger concern, which is that tourism tends to be a relatively unproductive industry. The holiday sector relies on lots of poorly paid workers, and those workers tend to have relatively low productivity growth. That means that people tend to seek out actually lower levels of education because they're able to get more money working in the tourism sector than they might otherwise get from being a student and taking that longer term view of their career. And so that can stunt investment in education over the long term, and that's really problematic for an economy's human capital.
So what is the policy response then if the benefits at some levels are clearly very good, but the bigger picture isn't quite so rosy?
The most common response tends to be to raise taxes on tourists, and these levies normally come in the form of hotel taxes that you pay upon check-in. Other places are taking a more draconian response, which is including limiting the number of passengers that can come off of cruise ships. In Barcelona, they are phasing out licenses for Airbnbs and the sort of short-term apartment rentals that are also taking up some of the housing stock. Greece is planning to cap the number of cruise ship berths in 2025. Cruise ship passengers have attracted a lot of the ire from policymakers because their dinner, their bed are all on the boat. So they come off of the ship for the day and crowd the streets and make a bit of a mess and then go home at night. But the locals are left with less of those economic rewards that they would hope to see from tourists.
So picking up on the simply levying more taxes point, the simple policy prescription, does it work? Will it work?
Tourist taxes are often ineffective, and in places where they are effective, you almost wouldn't want them to work. So in terms of reducing arrival numbers, most people go to places like Barcelona or Paris because they have cultural attractions, and tourists tend to be relatively insensitive to marginal price increases on those attractions. But in places, particularly in emerging markets, where they offer things that are highly substitutable, those tend to be booze and beaches, then tourist taxes can really affect the number of arrivals. In the Maldives, each 10% increase in tourist taxes reduces arrivals by about 5.4%. But in places like Barcelona, with really unique cultural attractions, taxes tend to result in a shift in tourist budgets rather than an increase in the amount that they're spending. So if tourist taxes increase the amount that you're spending on your hotel, you might spend less money in the restaurants or on tourist attractions in Barcelona.
You mentioned the effect of a marginal cost increase, but those tourist taxes are pretty marginal, right?
Yeah, so when I checked in Barcelona, you find that the tourist tax is really marginal. So I paid about €5.75 for my night. You can see that in the numbers, and that's because tourist taxes kind of add up pretty quickly. So if you're a couple traveling for a week and you're each paying €5 to €7, that adds up, and it might be a meal at a restaurant.
So in that sense, levying these taxes is sort of a zero-sum game.
Well, taxes can be really effective in helping shape how tourists visit a certain place. So, for example, in Japan, they are levying a congestion charge on particular trails on Mount Fuji, and that is trying to push tourists away from the most popular and crowded trails towards other climbs up the mountain. Venice is experimenting with a €5 entry charge for day trippers, and the hope there is that tourists will, rather than coming on a boat, will choose to stay in Venice and dine in the restaurants in the evening. Some places are being even more inventive. Copenhagen is offering tourists who use public transport and help keep the city green free meals and museum passes.
All this makes plenty of sense in an almost academic way, but what we haven't tackled is the anger that we're seeing in the news now from locals who feel overrun or, are tired of dirty streets and high rents.
I spoke to lots of locals in Barcelona who are really fed up with seeing the character of their streets change, and a lot of that change is driven by tourists. But ultimately, locals should really be focusing on some of the benefits that come from tourism. Higher prices are also going to be matched by higher wages with the income that's brought in from tourists from abroad. The boom in tourism should also cause local officials to think harder about how they provide housing supply in their cities, and making supply more responsive to tourist demand will lower house prices both for tourists and for locals. And finally, on the more economics wonky point, history shows that tourism receipts can be a really good thing for an economy. So in Spain and Italy, they use those tourism receipts to invest in capital goods, things like train lines and more hotels. And in Mexico, we see that actually there's a really positive relationship between something like manufacturing and increased tourist arrivals, because they're bringing in the money that's necessary to fund those big capital investments. And I think what this shows is that if policymakers think hard about how they manage the tourism boom, it really can be a benefit for both locals and visitors. And it shows that summer holidays really can be enjoyed by everyone.
Corbin, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Jason.
One video shows various men doing very ordinary jobs. So one's working in a supermarket, the other's a taxi driver. Over the taxi driver, the text reads, "Is this the path you wanted to take?"
Katie Bryant is a senior video producer at The Economist.
The footage jumps between the men wearing these civilian clothes in their ordinary settings and wearing military uniforms. And the closing text tells the viewer, "You're a man. Be a man."
Ты всегда понимал, чего хочешь.
Another shows a workout montage, which cuts to military men in the field. A voice blasts, "Today you know who you want to be and who you want to be with, what your path is and what it's for."
Твой путь и ради чего он.
This is all part of a Russian campaign to get men to volunteer to fight against Ukraine, because the Russian army is suffering its highest casualties since the start of the war.
So give me a sense of that. How are things going for Russians in the theater of war?
In May and June this year, around 1,200 Russian soldiers were being killed or wounded every day, and that's the highest rate since the beginning of the war. Ukrainian insiders estimate that for every one Ukrainian soldier killed on the battlefield, there are 6 Russian casualties. Now, you have to take that estimate with a pinch of salt. Western officials tell us the ratio is unlikely to be that high, but the Russian army is losing a lot of men. And so to deal with this, the Kremlin is trying to persuade more men to sign contracts with the army. And it's been pretty successful at that.
So why is it this push for volunteers? Why not simply draft new recruits in?
Putin's mass mobilization in September 2022 was extremely unpopular. There were widespread protests and many potential conscripts fled the country. So he's now doing everything he can to avoid a second big wave of conscription. And to persuade people to sign up voluntarily, the Kremlin's launched a propaganda push. So you've got your traditional adverts on billboards and videos, but the Kremlin's also trying a new strategy with more targeted messaging. So, for example, on specific channels on Telegram, which is a popular encrypted messaging app, or even with targeted phone messages. You've also got military bloggers and influencers playing an important role in glorifying the war and promoting signing up.
So is it working?
The Kremlin, unsurprisingly, doesn't disclose its casualties or exactly who it's sending to war. One state even reportedly banned the publication of soldiers' obituaries. So it's down to volunteers and journalists to work out exactly who is fighting and dying in Ukraine. And they use open source intelligence. That's social media pages, public obituaries, inheritance records, things they can find online, alongside physical evidence. So volunteers inside Russia travel to cemeteries and take pictures of new military graves. This is all to build a names database and work out exactly who is fighting and dying on the front line. I spoke to Mika Golubovsky, an editor at Mediazona, which is an independent Russian media outlet now operating in exile.
The team of the volunteers, they're spread out. Some of them are abroad. Some of them are inside Russia. Some of them are wandering the internet searching for sources on social media and that kind of stuff. Some are actually going to cemeteries and taking pictures of graves. It would be super idealistic probably to think that, a person could just read our update and suddenly become opposed to the war. Maybe that happens, maybe it doesn't, but super important to keep track of this.
This database is really valuable beyond just spreading awareness of the number of dead. It gives us an insight into how Putin's military strategy is changing over time. For example, at the start of the war, you see casualties for tank troops in Putin's abandoned march on Kyiv. And then in late 2022 and early 2023, large numbers of prison inmates start appearing in the data. And we analysed this data and we saw an increase in volunteers appearing in the casualty numbers. And this was corroborated by the UK Defence Ministry, which estimated that in May, the Russian army was managing to recruit about 30 to 40,000 soldiers every month.
So what is it, though, that's prompting so many people to go and actually sign up? Is it just down to the recruitment drive, the adverts you were talking about?
The adverts focus on ideals of masculinity. We saw that in the "You're a man, be a man" line. But they also draw out historical parallels. So there was one campaign saying, "This is your Stalingrad," in a reference to World War II. But crucially, what we've also seen in recent months is an increase in payments to recruits. That money varies between regions. In some places, new recruits are offered as much as 1.5 million rubles. That's almost $17,000. So a lot of these recruits are being offered a lot more than a year's salary to go to Ukraine.
So with that kind of offer on the table, I imagine that Mr. Putin is still going to find plenty of volunteers.
We know that the Kremlin certainly think they can. According to Russi, which is a think tank, the Kremlin believes it can keep up its current rate of attrition until the end of 2025. But the thing is, that's a high rate of attrition. Putin's current style of warfare is being called a meat grinder tactic, where they essentially send in wave after wave of troops. Ukrainian commanders have described seeing Russian soldiers advancing over the corpses of their own troops. What's helping the Kremlin is that Russia has a large population and, more importantly, widespread areas of poverty. So that does give Putin a deep pool of potential recruits.
Katie, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks very much.
I wouldn't say this was the sound of the 90s and early 2000s, but man, it was definitely a sound from then. Anybody remember Nokia phones? Anybody remember thinking nobody could touch Nokia's market share? Those days. Like other makes, they only had one kind of messaging, text, and even that was limited to 160 characters, which still took an age to type out, trying to turn numbers into letters. Oh, and that game Snake, which was more fun than it now sounds. You'd think this kind of phone was a thing left entirely in the technological past, but as with so many things that go out of fashion, they're mounting a comeback, if only because their smartphone descendants do just too much.
In the rich world, we are pretty addicted to our smartphones. 9 in 10 Americans have a smartphone.
Annie Crable is The Economist's U.S. news editor.
The average screen time is 3 hours and 45 minutes a day. A lot of people would admit to feeling adrift without their phone, kind of clutch it in their hands at all times. It's probably a familiar description to many people.
So that is to say that people have got very accustomed to smartphones and all the many things that smartphones can do for them. So how is it then that people are going in technological reverse? How big is that trend towards dumb phones?
Feature phones, which confusingly is the industry name for dumb phones, make up 2% of American phone sales. But demand is growing for them. We can see that from new products that are launching and firms that are re-releasing nostalgic versions of the phones that many of us, if you're age millennial-ish or older, grew up with. So the Finnish firm HMD bought the rights to manufacture Nokia phones in 2016. And it says that it now sells tens of thousands of these phones monthly in the United States. And in May, it re-released a very familiar brick, super simple, classic Nokia 3210 in Europe.
I remember my Nokia 3210. I had it for absolutely years. It was bulletproof, and I loved it for that reason. But surely after all this time, that's not exactly the same thing that's being made. This is like a sort of 3210-esque kind of phone.
Well, for some people, that's actually exactly the appeal, the hyper simplistic. It's so kind of difficult to text on it. It's clunky. And, that's kind of the point for a lot of people. But you're right. There actually are a lot of tech-forward options, too. It's not just replicas of the phones that we had in 2004. So there's something called the Light Phone, which is shaped kind of like a chunky iPod. And it has an e-ink screen, which is what Kindles have. So on that, you can get some of the basic apps that you might think you really need to function today. So maps, podcasts, music, but not a lot of the entertainment-driven apps or the highly distracting ones. And the 3210 still does have those mobile keys. It still is just as clunky to text on, and it still has Snake, which was a favorite of mine in the 8th grade.
Oh yeah, that takes me back. It seems still so strange, though, to go simple and then yet to go somewhere in the middle to have, some of the options, some of the smart features and so on. What's actually going on here behind this shift in the market?
There are kind of 3 groups of people based on my reporting that are driving this demand. So the first group would be people who are pretty tech savvy, but want to feel that they're in control of their technology, not that it's controlling them. So those people might be opting for the Light Phone. There are Gen Zers who grew up with social media and feel so sick of it. And they might be kind of more the flip phone or old school Nokia phone market. And then there are parents of children. And this is one of the newest groups of people pushing for dumb phones. There's a lot of anxiety now about the mental health effects on children, especially using smartphones. So we've seen schools in the UK, Eton, one of the leading fee-paying schools, banned smartphones for new pupils. They will be issued dumb phones in the autumn. And then there's a kind of middle ground of people who don't actually go all the way in buying a dumb phone, but they want to dumb down their smartphones. So some people set timers for themselves on maybe the social media apps that they use. Maybe they'll just remove those apps altogether from their phones, or they'll impose greater restrictions and purchase these external devices that require kind of like a physical unlocking of your phone in order to access some of the more distracting apps like social media. I think it basically just gets to smartphones have become fully integrated in the fabric of our lives, and there are a lot of benefits to it. But what we're seeing with this dumb phone pushback is that people feel that it's gone too far, and they're just trying to take back control of their time and attention.
Well, thanks for giving us some of your time and attention, Annie.
Thank you, Jason.
That's all for this episode of The Intelligence. We'll see you back here tomorrow.